Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So I have to begin by thanking the Civil Service College for allowing us to use the auditorium. We are now in exam mode in the Lee Kuan Yew School, so all the lecture halls are taken up. And I also want to apologize to Amory that a bit of rain got in the way in terms of the participation from the audience. We were expecting a bigger group, but I think the rain deterred lots of people. So Amory, your next big thing is not reinventing fire, is reinventing dry weather. Anyway, as some of you may know, I always make 3 points when I introduce a speech or lecture at the Lee Kuan Yew School. My 3 points are what I call good news, bad news, and the solution. Oh, I'm glad we have more people coming in. The good news, as you know, is that the world is getting better. The number of people living with middle-class living standards is going from 1 billion in 1990 to 2.5 billion today, and we estimate that it will reach 4.2 billion by 2025. Now you multiply that by the number of cars, air conditioners, lights, washing machines that you will need for 4.2 billion people, you realize that the good news very soon becomes bad news, because the bad news is that you will need lots and lots of energy to fuel all this tremendous new demand that is going to come from the 4.2 billion people with American living class standards. So we do have, in a sense, the world's biggest problem to solve here. And fortunately, to solve the world's biggest problem, we have the world's best man to solve this problem, and his name is Amory Lovins. Now, I could tell you a lot about him, but I'm going to be, with your permission, Amory, very brief. But I want to begin by saying that he's a very bad role model for a Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy student, because he dropped out not of one, but 2 universities. And they were Harvard and Oxford. And so he went on to, as you can tell, he went on to chase his passion. And from 1980 to 81, he served on the U.S. Department of Energy Senior Advisory Board. He co-founded the Rocky Mountain Institute, you can see there, a non-profit think tank in 1982, so I guess that makes it 30 years old now, with his wife, Hunter. In 1993, he received the Nissan Prize for inventing super-efficient, ultralight hybrid cars. And from 1999 to 2001, he served on the Defense Science Board Task Forces on Military Energy Strategy, a role he took on again from 2006 to 2008. Now, I want to emphasize that his work on energy efficiency and resource management has been recognized globally, and I mean it truly globally, with a diverse range of organizations such as Time Magazine, the MacArthur Fellowship, the Ashoka Fellowship, and the Onassis Foundations. He's also taught in various universities, University of California, Dartmouth College, University of Colorado, University of St. Gallen, Peking University, and Stanford University. So you can see dropouts have a future too. But please finish your exams and do graduate. He's highly sought after all over the world, and I can confirm this because when I go to various places in the world, in Davos, Ditchley, and other places, he's there. But I want to actually end by just quoting a brief blurb from the back of this book that he's going to speak about, Reinventing Fire, from one of the world's, I guess, best informed and wisest persons today, and this is President Bill Clinton. And this is what Bill Clinton says at the back. He says, "My friend, Amory Lovins, knows that the most important question of the 21st century is the how question. How we turn good ideas into working solutions. Reinventing Fire is a wise, detailed, and comprehensive blueprint for gathering the best existing technologies for energy use and bring them to work right now to create jobs and end our dependence on climate-changing fossil fuels and unleash the enormous economic potential of the coming energy revolution." He will have many surprising and interesting things to tell us, And I hope that after he finishes his 45-minute lecture, in the Q&A, he'll come up with even more brilliant things to share with us. Amory, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the honor of sharing with you today the findings of an ambitious synthesis of American energy solutions that I think have much wider application. 60 colleagues and I at our little nonprofit Think and Do Tank did the work I'll describe during 1.5 years with much help from industry on both content and peer review, and we published the result as the business book that Kishore was holding, Reinventing Fire, 1 year ago, with forwards from the president of Shell Oil and the chairman of our biggest nuclear and third biggest coal-fired utility, because they felt it spoke to their industry's strategic interests and needs. There are a number of foreign editions out already. The Chinese edition is due from Hunan Science and Technology Press in around the middle of next year. So here's what we found. Now, America's got this public conversation about energy that is really rather strange. It boils down to a multiple choice test. Since we're in exam period, would you rather die of A, oil wars, or B, climate change, or C, nuclear holocaust, or D, all of the above? Oh, I missed one. How about E, none of the above, which is the option we're seldom offered. But what if we could make energy do our work without working our undoing? Could we imagine fuel without fear? Could we reinvent fire? And we chose this big and poetic title because fossil fuels made us human. Well, actually, it goes back further. Fire made us human. Fossil fuels made us modern. But now we need a new fire that makes us safe, secure, healthy, and durable. And this has now become possible, in fact, at lower cost than what we are doing. So let's see how. Now, 4/5 of the world's energy comes from digging up and burning every year 19 cubic kilometers of the rotted remains of primeval swamp goo. As a member of the U.S. National Petroleum Council, I should tell you, and it is also true, that those fossil fuels have built our civilization, created our wealth, enriched the lives of billions of people. They also, though, have increasing costs to our security, economy, health, and environment that are eroding, if not outweighing, their benefits. So we need a new fire. Switching from the old fire to the new fire means changing two big stories, oil and electricity, each of which puts 2/5 of the fossil carbon into the air. And these two stories are quite distinct. In the U.S., for example, less than 1% of our electricity is made from oil, but 1/3 is made from coal. And in China at the moment, about 73% is made from coal, down, by the way, from 85% early this year. Incredibly rapid evolution as the renewables take over the new plant installations. And yet, although these stories are quite distinct, the ways we use oil and electricity are similarly concentrated. In the U.S., for example, 3/4 of our oil fuels transport, 3/4 of our electricity runs buildings, and the rest of both run factories. So very efficient vehicles, buildings, and factories save a lot of oil and coal, and also natural gas that can displace both of them. But today's energy system is not only inefficient, it is also dirty and aging and disconnected and insecure. It needs refurbishment. But by 2050, it could become efficient, connected, and distributed with elegantly frugal autos, buildings, and factories, all relying on an efficient, modern, secure, resilient electricity system. So we could eliminate our addiction to oil and coal by 2050 and also use 1/3 less natural gas while shifting to efficient use and renewable supplies. That's the story I'll be describing: tripled efficiency and switching to 3/4 renewables. And by 2050, this shift could cost $5 trillion less in net present value than business as usual, assuming that carbon emissions and all other external or hidden costs are worth zero, a conservatively low estimate. But this cheaper energy system could support a 158% bigger U.S. economy, all with no oil, no coal, for that matter, no nuclear energy, and without any new national federal taxes or mandates or subsidies or laws, thus going around the gridlock in Washington. Let me say that again. I'm going to tell you how the United States can get completely off oil and coal, $5 trillion cheaper, with no act of Congress led by business for profit. And this wouldn't even require any new inventions. I'm not saying no new policies are required. In fact, there are quite a few policy changes needed, but it turns out they can all be done administratively or at a state level, a subnational level, much as in many countries in Europe, Germany, for example, or in China. We see a lot of the leadership coming from the provincial and municipal level. Now, with such sensible policy support from whatever level, we can use our most effective institutions. So in the U.S. case, that would be private enterprise co-evolving with civil society and with state and local government and sped by military innovation to go around our least effective institutions, such as the Congress. And this works regardless of your ideology. So whether you care most about profits and jobs and competitive advantage, or about national security, or about environmental stewardship and public health and climate protection, Reinventing Fire makes sense and makes money. Now, General Eisenhower reputedly said that if a problem can't be solved, enlarge it. Normally, we take the chef's cleaver and, like Chinese cooking, we hack the big problem into little bite-sized pieces, but this doesn't always make it soluble, often quite the opposite. Because what we really needed to do was move the boundaries of the problem outward to encompass more options, more synergies, more degrees of freedom that the solution required. Therefore, in our Reinventing Fire grand synthesis, we combined and integrated all 4 energy-using sectors: transport, buildings, industry, and electricity. And we combined 4 kinds of innovation, not just the usual 2, technology and public policy, but also 2 more powerful ones normally omitted, namely design, the way we combine technologies, and strategy, new business models, new competitive strategies. And these combinations yield much more than the sum of their parts, especially in creating deeply disruptive business opportunities. Where should we start? Well, since 3/5 of U.S. mobility fuel goes to autos, let's start by making autos oil-free. 2/3 of the energy it takes to move a typical car is caused by its weight. And every unit of energy we save at the wheels by taking out weight or drag saves another 6 units of energy we don't need to waste getting it to the wheels. So it saves altogether 7 units of fuel at the tank. Huge leverage. And yet for the past quarter century, our 2-ton steel autos have suffered an epidemic of obesity. They've gained weight twice as fast as we have. But fortunately, we now have ultralight, ultra-strong materials like carbon fiber composites that can bring these dramatic weight savings that can snowball and actually even make the cars, as I'll describe, easier and cheaper to build. Well, lighter and more slippery autos need less force to move them, so their engine gets smaller, and in fact it gets small enough that we can afford to make it electric, because you need 2 or 3 times fewer of those costly batteries or fuel cells, so they get lighter and cheaper, and the total price of the car falls to about today's level. And then, of course, the driving cost per kilometer is very much lower from the start. So these innovations can transform automakers from wringing tiny savings out of essentially Victorian steel stamping and engine technologies to the steeply falling costs of 3 strongly reinforcing technologies: the ultralight materials, their manufacturing techniques, and electric propulsion. Any of you with business training will recognize that if you're making, say, a car with 3 steeply falling cost curves, 3 steep learning curves that strongly reinforce each other, and your competitor is making cars with 1 learning curve because they're doing something conventional like a steel hybrid, you're going to win. Now, this will happen faster. The sales can grow and the prices can drop faster for these electrified ultralight vehicles if we temporarily use a policy instrument called a fee-bate. That means rebates to efficient new cars paid for by fees on inefficient new cars. The fees paying for the rebates, so it's size and revenue neutral. And this widens the price spread within each size class by perhaps quite a few thousand US. So it arbitrages the spread in discount rate between the private buyer and society. That is, as a car buyer, perhaps in a place that doesn't have the wise policies of Singapore, but more of a laissez-faire economy where cars are cheap, you would end up taking a long-term view. You would look at the full 15 years' worth of fuel savings when you bought your car, rather than just the first year or two, as most people would say in the United States. There are 5 such programs in Europe, by the way, and in the biggest one in its first 2 years tripled the speed of improving car efficiency. Now, the resulting shift to electric autos will be as game-changing as shifting from small changes in typewriters to the dramatic Moore's Law-driven changes in computers. Of course, computers and electronics are now our biggest industry. Typewriter makers have vanished. So this vehicle fitness, taking out the obesity of the car, opens a new automotive competitive strategy that doubles the expected oil savings in 40 years, but also makes affordable the oil savings from electrification, and those save the rest of the oil. America or Japan or China could lead this next automotive revolution. Actually, it would very well fit the mix of industries in Singapore if you wanted to do it here. And the formidable barriers are much more cultural than they are technological or economic. U.S. automakers, having just had a near-death experience that concentrated the mind wonderfully, are starting to tackle these barriers, and we're helping. But the current leader is Germany. Last year, Volkswagen announced that next year it will enter mass production on this carbon fiber plug-in hybrid car rated at 1 liter per 100 kilometers. BMW announced that next year they will enter mid-volume production of this carbon fiber electric car, and they confirmed that its carbon fiber is paid for by needing fewer batteries, and their CEO said, "We do not intend to be a typewriter maker," because he can look across München to where Olympia used to make excellent typewriters. Audi claimed it's going to beat them both by a year. Audi just showed in Paris a few weeks ago a carbon fiber plug-in hybrid SUV concept car rated at 0.9 liters per 100 kilometers. Now, there are some interesting things that others can bring to the party. For example, 7 years ago, this test piece for military helmets that are now shipping was made in 1 minute using a new production technique developed by a little company I used to chair, one of our spin-offs from our nonprofit, because it's a think and do tank. And this makes quite a good carbon cap, as you see, but also if I ring it like a bell, you can tell from the sound how immensely stiff and strong it is. And let's pass it round. Good catch. Don't worry about dropping it. It's tougher than titanium. Tom Friedman, the journalist, actually hit it with a sledgehammer as hard as he could and didn't even scuff it. Now, if you take such manufacturing techniques for ultralight structures that can scale to automotive cost and speed, but with essentially aerospace performance, you can save about 80% of the capital needed for automaking. I'll explain that in a minute. You can save a lot of lives because such materials can absorb 6 to 12 times the crash energy per kilo of steel and do so more smoothly. And you can also save oil equivalent just in the U.S. to 1.5 Saudi Arabias or half an OPEC. And those saved barrels cost only $18 each, which actually is for the electrification, because as I'll explain in a moment, the ultralighting is free. But those saved barrels are also domestic, secure, carbon-free, and inexhaustible. Now, let's see how the ultralighting can be free. This is a physical model of a complete virtual design that our team did 12 years ago for a crossover midsize SUV made of carbon fiber, saving over half the weight. And it would do 3.56 liters per 100 kilometers on petrol or 2.06 with hydrogen. And it would be about a 2-year payback against the low American petrol prices. But if you look inside, you find the structure has only 14 parts, and it's actually suspended from rings rather than built up from a tub, which is our horse and buggy legacy in the auto business. Each of these parts can be made with one low-pressure die set, but a normal SUV body would have 10 or 20 times more parts than this, each made with an average of 4 steel stamping die sets at high pressure. So you've already saved about 98 or 99% of the tooling cost. And then each part can be lifted with one hand and no hoist. In fact, this biggest part on the side I can briefly lift with just one finger. The parts then snap precisely together for bonding, which can now be done at high speed by induction. And that means you don't need the robotic body shop anymore. And if you lay color in the mold, you don't need the paint shop either. So there go the 2 hardest and costliest steps in automaking. And you end up saving, as I mentioned, 80% of the total capital in automaking. And also the propulsion system gets about 3 times smaller and lighter and cheaper. And the savings in both the automaking and the propulsion system pay for the carbon fiber, making the ultralighting approximately free. We've now nailed that down with very granular production cost data from McKinsey's former head of automotive practice. And by the way, carbon fiber itself is also about to get a lot cheaper. Now, the trick is how you design such a car. We used very different techniques borrowed from the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works. That is apparently how Toyota designed this concept car 5 years ago. It's called the 1X, 1 over X, because it has the size of a Prius inside, 1 over 1, but half the fuel use and 1/3 the weight. If this were an ordinary hybrid like today's Prius, it would weigh 400 kilograms. That is the current lightweighting benchmark, and quite an exciting one, since 400 kilos happens to be what I wrote in 1991 a good 4-seat carbon car should weigh, to much hilarity from the industry, as you can imagine. Now, lest it be thought that Toyota was doing this for amusement, they signaled their strategic intent rather clearly, because the day before they showed this, Toray in Japan, the biggest maker of carbon fiber in the world, announced a major factory to mass-produce carbon fiber car parts for Toyota, not a phrase previously much heard in the industry. And then 4 more automakers joined this consortium. So Volkswagen and BMW will have worthy competitors, and not only in Japan. Now, the same physics and the same business logic also apply to heavy vehicles. For example, heavy trucks lose 2/3 of their over-the-road energy to air drag. So here's a bus, which kind of looks like a heavy truck, except it has half the air drag through very careful attention to aerodynamic detail. And it turns out, with better aerodynamics and tires and engines and so on, you can save about 2/3 of the fuel used by heavy trucks. Actually, Walmart's giant truck fleet has already captured a lot of this potential and even more in logistical improvements. So through better logistics and design, they've already cut in 6 years their fuel use per case of product by 44%. And they're intending to save a lot more than that. So if you combine the truck savings with the triple to quintupled efficiency airplanes now being designed at places like Boeing and NASA and MIT, you end up with net present valued U.S. savings around $0.9 trillion on the heavy vehicles. In both the light and heavy vehicles, these civilian innovations are being sped by military ones. U.S. military uses less than 2% of the oil, but they have very strong reasons for wanting to save oil because of the immense cost and risk of delivering the oil where it's needed in the battle space. They hadn't counted that cost before, but now that they've started to, it means they're effectively valuing saved fuel typically 10 and sometimes 100 times higher than they used to do. So that's driving very efficient designs. That innovation will come back into the civilian sector, which uses 50-odd times more oil, and speed up the development of super efficient civilian platforms in much the same way that military innovation in the past gave us the internet, the global positioning system, the jet engine industry, the microchip industry, creating really the foundations of today's economy. And that indeed can help lead my country and many others off oil so nobody needs to fight over oil, and the warfighters really like that idea. Neg emissions in the Persian Gulf, mission unnecessary. Now, as we design and build vehicles better, we can also use them smarter. Singapore may be the world leader in a lot of these techniques and in charging the real social cost of driving to support a terrific public transport system. But in the United States, we haven't been that smart, so this is a graph of our daily traffic congestion. It kind of looks like Beijing, although Beijing is now starting to adopt Singapore policies, and that's a good thing. But, if this were electricity load shape, we would throw a lot of IT-enabled pricing and demand response and smart grid stuff at it to try to flatten it out. And by not yet doing this for road traffic, we are wasting many billions of dollars a year in idle people, idle vehicles, and idle roads. However, rather than just waiting for driving demand to double, as is officially forecast, we can use 4 very powerful techniques to reduce needless driving. We can charge for road infrastructure by the kilometer, not by the liter. We can use IT to enhance public transport and to make car sharing and ride sharing very attractive. After all, the typical asset utilization of an American car is only 4%. So it sits idle 96% of the time, and you can do a lot of good business models around that and reduce the number of cars needed to serve a population by factors of 10, 20 or more. We can also allow and encourage smart growth and new urbanist development patterns so that more people are already where they want to be and don't need to go somewhere else. This also turns out to be more profitable for the developer because it's a better way to live. And we can use IT to make traffic free flowing. So when we combine all those in a country that lacks Singapore's very enlightened transport policies, the U.S. could get the same access with 46 to 84% less driving and save about $0.4 trillion that way, plus another $0.3 trillion from smarter use of trucks. So 40 years from now, a very much more mobile U.S. economy, notice how much more mobile, could be using no oil. And saving or displacing each barrel for $25 average cost, rather than buying it for well over $100, would save $4 trillion net present value. not counting any externalities. Now, if I counted just the hidden economic and military costs of U.S. oil dependence, that saving would triple to $12 trillion. Pretty soon we're talking real money. So to get mobility without oil, we can first get efficient and then switch fuels. So to phase out the oil, we start with the government forecast efficiency. We add a lot more that they left out that's due to vehicle fitness. We add a bit more from more productive use of vehicles, chiefly cars, and then those 1 or 2 liter per 100 kilometer cars can run on any mixture of hydrogen, electricity, and advanced biofuels. The trucks and airplanes can run on, realistically, hydrogen or advanced biofuels, or the trucks could even use natural gas, but none of them will need oil. And the most biofuel we might need, 3 million barrels a day, could be made 2/3 from wastes and without displacing cropland and without harming climate or soil. So our little team at RMI speeds up all these kinds of savings by what we call institutional acupuncture. That is where the business logic is congested and not flowing properly. We get the chi moving by inserting little needles at the right points with partners like Ford and Walmart and the Pentagon. In the 6 sectors that need to be transformed, this long transition is already well underway. Even 3 years ago, mainstream analysts were starting to see peak oil not in supply but in demand. So what we're really seeing is that oil is becoming uncompetitive even at low prices before it becomes unavailable even at high prices. And that's why Deutsche Bank 3 years ago forecast that world oil use could peak around 2016. But the electrified autos that help this happen do not need to add new burdens to the already stressed electricity system. Rather, when smart electric cars exchange electricity and information through smart buildings with smart grids, they are adding to the grid flexibility and storage that help the grid to accept varying solar and wind power. So electric cars make it easier to solve the electricity and car problems together than separately. We enlarge the problem to make it soluble. And electric cars also converge the oil story with our second big story, which is saving electricity and then making it differently. And those twin revolutions in electricity are bringing more numerous and diverse and profound disruptions to electricity than to any other sector, because in essence we've got 21st century technology and speed colliding head-on with 20th and even 19th century institutions, rules, and cultures. Now, changing how we make electricity gets easier if we need less of it. Today it's mostly wasted. I was just commenting out in the hall that although there are compact fluorescents, there's also a whole row of little halogen lights which we can replace with others close to 10 times more efficient and requiring no maintenance and with very good economics. And everywhere you look, there's stuff like this. I'm looking up into an incandescent right now. The efficiency techniques keep improving faster than we apply them. So the unbought reserve of negawatts keeps getting bigger and cheaper. But as we get better at delivering efficiency and financing efficiency, the buildings and industries that use it can start to get efficient faster than they grow. And then, for example, U.S. electricity use, rather than growing 1% a year as officially forecast, could shrink 1% a year even after allowing for the extra use for the electric autos. We can do this by reasonably accelerating existing trends. Specifically, over the next 40 years, U.S. buildings could mostly retrofit, because we've already built most of them, can save 2/3 to 3/4 of their energy. That is, they can triple or quadruple their energy productivity and thereby save $1.4 trillion US dollars net present value with a 33% internal rate of return. So the savings are worth 4 times their cost. And U.S. industry could double its energy productivity with a 21% IRR. And to get these things done by 2050 would mean that over the next 20 years, we simply have to ramp up the average national adoption of efficiency to levels that some of our states have already achieved. So whatever exists is possible. That doesn't sound unrealistic. There is a disruptive innovation we've developed at RMI called integrative design that can do even better because it often makes very large energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into expanding returns. And that's how our 2010 retrofit is saving 2/5 of the energy in the Empire State Building. Retrofitting or remanufacturing the 6,514 windows on site in a little improvised window factory on a vacant floor into super windows that pass light but block heat, plus better lights and office equipment and so on, cut the maximum cooling load by a third, and then instead of installing bigger chillers, we could renovate smaller ones, saving over $17 million of capex, which, as you can see, paid for well over half the cost of the entire retrofit, thus cutting the payback time to 3 years. That is, by the way, the same payback time that a major energy service company had offered to do, but with disintegrated design, saving 6 times less than we actually did save. There was another interesting example. You may recall that the Empire State Building is mostly opaque wall, not windows, because it was built around 1929-30. But with modern curtain wall offices, all glass and no windows, we had another case like this where you could actually save 3/4 of the peak cooling load, and this sort of saving was slightly bigger than the total cost of the retrofit. So by doing these improvements all together at the right time when you were about to replace the facade anyway, because the glazing seals fail every 20 years. So by doing the right things at the right time, we found you could get about a minus 5-month payback. It was a little cheaper than the regular renovation you have to do anyway that saves nothing. And some other retrofits elsewhere are saving as much as 70%. And making certain new buildings actually better than new. So the state of the art's moving very rapidly. Now let's try a small building in a climate opposite to yours. My wife Judy and I live at 2,200 meters up in the Rocky Mountains. It's high desert, and it used to go as low as minus 44 Celsius on occasion. Minus 40 is the freezing point of mercury. You can tell if it's minus 40 because if you spit, not allowed, I know, in Singapore, before it hits the ground, it'll make a little popping or crackling sound and freeze. That's really cold. Now, this building recently got an award for having inspired 30,000-odd European passive buildings, which, like ours, need and have no heating system. They stay warm by themselves by capturing light through the windows and not letting it out again through super insulation. These super windows actually insulate as well as 14 sheets of glass, or our best ones like 22 sheets of glass, but they look like 2 and cost less than 3. It doesn't have to look like this to work like this. It can look like whatever you want. But now let's come inside this atrium to see how this passive building works. And like the passive buildings in Europe, it came in at normal construction cost. So in February, while it's blizzarding outside, these are 2 of the 5 banana crops that were ripening at that time. We're now up to banana crop number 46, assuming our resident orangutans don't get them first. They're taxidermically challenged, but after midnight there's no telling what they get up to. When we first moved in '84, this building was saving about 99% of the usual space and water heating energy, and half the water and 90% of the household electricity, all with a 10-month payback. Well, in fact, the cost of getting rid of the heating system was about minus $1,100 US, because we saved that much more eliminating the heating system from the capital budget than we paid to do so. And then we used that money plus a little more to get the 10-month payback from these other savings as well. Of course, today's technologies are much better than the 1983 models, so we've retrofitted them, and now we're monitoring about 300 data streams to see how much better they are. The trouble is the measuring equipment seems to be using more electricity than the lights and appliances. Now, this approach to design actually works in any climate. It's been used in hot, dry climates to eliminate air conditioning with better comfort and lower construction cost up to at least 46 Celsius. It's been used by an architecture professor in Bangkok, more like your climate, to save 90% of the air conditioning energy in his house with exactly normal construction cost and better comfort. The key, regardless of which climate you're in, is integrative design that gives multiple benefits from single expenditure. So this white arch along the top actually has 12 benefits, but only one cost. Now, integrative design can also increase the $500 billion of conventional energy savings in industry. Dow Chemical, for example, has already saved $9 billion on a $1 billion efficiency investment, but there's much more to do. For example, 3/5 of the world's electricity is used in motors, and half of that runs pumps and fans. Now, we can make the pumps and fans a lot better. We can do about 35 things to the motor systems, which together pay back in about a year to save half the energy. But first, we ought to be capturing bigger and cheaper savings that are not yet normal practice, are not in any of the engineering textbooks yet, are not in any of the energy studies yet, except ours. Let me give you an example. Pumps are the biggest use of motors, and they move liquid through pipes. But in a factory built for Shanghai, using techniques that we learned from the Singaporean engineering genius, Mr. Lee Eng-lok, we were able to help a Dutch colleague save at least 86% of the pumping energy, not by using better pumps or motors, but just by replacing long, thin, crooked pipes with fat, short, straight pipes. In fact, this is a Singaporean example that Mr. Lee designed. I think this one saved 60-odd%. And in general, the capital cost goes down because the pumps and motors get so much smaller. So this isn't really about new technology so much as rearranging our mental furniture as designers. And what does this mean? What does it mean that doing the same thing in some piping in our house, we were able to save about 97% of the friction and pumping energy? Well, from the coal or other fuel burnt in the power plant, there are so many compounding losses in the power and pumping system that only about 1/10 of the original fuel energy at the power plant actually comes out the pipe as flow. But now let's take those compounding losses from left to right and turn them around backwards from right to left so they can become compounding savings. And then every unit of flow or friction that we save in the pipe compounds back to save 10 units of fuel and cost and pollution back at the power plant. And as you go back upstream, of course, the components are getting smaller and cheaper. Now, our team has lately found such snowballing energy savings in many diverse industrial redesigns, over $30 billion worth, everything from this Hewlett-Packard data center or this Texas Instruments chip fab to Rio Tinto and Anglo-American mines and Shell hydrocarbon facilities and so on. Very diverse projects in about 29 sectors. And typically our retrofit designs save about 30 to 60% of the energy with 2 or 3 year paybacks. And in new facilities, the savings are a bit bigger, say 40 to 90-odd%, but almost always with lower capital cost. In fact, this chip fab was built in Texas, not in China, because together we were able to take out $230 million of capital cost, or about 30%, while saving a lot of energy and water. And I think our latest chip fab design is slated to use about 2/3 less energy at half the normal capital cost. This is another interesting story on the data center built in the north of England. The client, which was the Inland Revenue, was so conservative it would not allow EDS to adopt most of our recommendations, so we were only able to triple the efficiency at normal capex. But EDS told us that had the client allowed them to adopt all of our recommendations that EDS agreed with, they would have expected to save about 95% of the energy at about half the capex. So lots to do. Now, when we save so much electricity in buildings and industry, that makes easier and faster the shift to new sources of electricity, chiefly renewables. Their explosive growth and their plummeting cost, shown here on a logarithmic scale, is led by China. These are the data for the capital cost in the market of photovoltaic modules and wind farms, and both are now headed well down. In fact, the photovoltaic costs are now off the bottom of the chart at about 80 US cents a watt. So this development has made solar and wind power marketplace winners. In windy parts of the United States, the new wind power contracts have an unsubsidized price of 4 cents US per kilowatt hour. The California power auction this spring cleared with photovoltaic power, cheaper than gas power, despite our supposedly cheap gas. The photovoltaics came in under 9 US cents a kilowatt hour, or unsubsidized, that would be under 13 cents. And yet our developers pay twice as much for the installed total cost of a solar project as German developers do. We all buy the same equipment, but by going to scale, the Germans have wrung out so much cost from the whole value chain that they're at half the cost. They're at about 7 to 9 US cents a kilowatt hour unsubsidized. But our developers in the US, despite their twice German prices, can already in about 20 states put solar cells on the roof of your house with no down payment and beat your electric bill. Think about it. This means it's an unregulated product which you can combine with others to make a virtual utility that can bypass the electric company much as your cell phone bypassed the wireline phone company. So this sort of thing gives nightmares to utility executives and sweet dreams to venture capitalists. Or utilities could, of course, turn this competition into a new business opportunity. We're helping some of them do that. Now, this graph shows the extraordinary growth in the annual net additions worldwide of wind power and solar power. And solar and wind were actually 68% of the new capacity added in Europe last year. The world became able last year to make 59 billion watts, sorry, that should be 59, not 50, the data changed, of solar cells, and now it's closer to 80. I was just visiting a Chinese plant a few weeks ago where one plant, not much bigger than this building, can produce 2.5 gigawatts of solar cells every year. So the real revolution here is that the private sector has turned the means of making electricity into a scalable, mass-produced, manufactured product. It's not like building cathedrals. It's more like cell phones or computers or chips. The clean energy industry just invested its trillionth dollar last year since 2004. It's got over 1 million new jobs in Europe. And last year, the renewables, other than big hydro, added up to 84 billion new watts added and 225 billion US dollars of new private investment. So resources like these have now put in cumulatively over 1.5 times the total world capacity of nuclear energy, which had a $1 trillion and half-century head start. But in contrast, the orders for nuclear plants, and for that matter coal plants, continue to fade because they have too much cost and financial risk. The nuclear net additions were already less than zero before the Fukushima disaster. And in the US, we've been running an experiment for 7 years in which we've offered federal subsidies of 100% or more for building new nuclear plants, and yet none of the 34 proposed units was able to raise a penny of private capital because they had no business case. But meanwhile, whilst the central plants have these rising and prohibitive capital costs and the price of natural gas is volatile and rising, the efficiency of renewables keep getting cheaper and they have no fuel. So these modern competitors have already taken away in 6 years a third of our U.S. market for coal, and the other 2/3 could go as well to those competitors at below coal plants' operating costs. We are often told, though, that coal and nuclear stations are the only way to keep the lights on because they are 24/7, whilst solar and wind are variable and therefore supposedly unreliable. But actually, there's no such thing as a 24/7 power plant. They all break sooner or later. And when one of them fails, you just lost 1,000 megawatts in milliseconds, often for weeks or months, often without warning. And it's to cope with this intermittence that we've always designed the grid to back up failed plants with working plants. But in exactly the same way, the grid can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by using a diversified portfolio of renewables so they don't all fail at the same time, forecasting them, and then integrating them with other resources on the grid, including other renewables that are dispatchable, so you can have them whenever you want. And indeed, on that basis, our National Renewable Energy Lab in the U.S. just published a detailed account of how to do 80 or 90% U.S. renewable energy supply for all our electricity with interesting economics. Let me give you an example of how this can work. And this is a tough case. It's Texas, which is isolated from the rest of the United States in many ways, but including electricity. It has its own grid. And in 2050, it's forecast to have this load shape during 1 week with the daily peaks and night troughs. Well, if you use the electricity in a profitably efficient way, the peaks get smaller and less peaky. There's still about 30 gigawatts of load there. Well, let's meet 84% of the annual electric needs with wind and photovoltaics, both using actual data. Not a great match to the load shape. Now let's meet the other 14% with other renewables that are dispatchable. You can have them whenever you want, namely geothermal, small hydro, municipal waste combustion, solar thermal electric, burning biogas in existing gas turbines. It's a little bit better match, but we still have too much sometimes and not enough at other times. So now let's take these surpluses and put them into two kinds of distributed storage that are quite inexpensive, namely smart charging of electric vehicles and ice storage air conditioning, which would be, of course, especially nice in Singapore because you could use the solar power in the daytime to make the ice and then use it at night. In other parts of the world, you'd use wind power at night and store the ice to use in the daytime. But at any rate, you can get the stored electricity from those distributed storages back when you need it, that's in yellow, and then you can fill in the last bits with unobtrusively flexible demand, and now all the moving parts fit together properly, giving you reliable power supply every hour of the year with very good economics, and only 5% of the renewable power is left over. So there are actually places that are doing this sort of choreography of variable renewables. Even 2 years ago, 4 German states were 43 to 52% wind powered on an annual basis. Portugal, 45% renewably powered. Denmark, 36%. And actually, all of Germany, by the middle of this year, was 26% renewable. They've doubled it in 5 years. They projected to double again by about 2025. And at times this spring, up to 60% of all German electricity came from renewables. So such European experience is supporting a shift over decades to largely or wholly renewable electricity for the whole European Union. There's another important change going on as well, particularly in Denmark, which used to have just very centralized coal-fired power plants, but over 32 years they've shifted to extremely decentralized and almost all agricultural waste-fired, like surplus straw, combined heat and power plants, plus in blue, wind power with 86% of the wind capacity owned by the farmers or by cooperatives in their village. And Denmark has a conservative government that expects on this model to meet all of their electric and all of their energy needs renewably by 2050 at essentially normal cost, and with much greater resilience because they've been redesigning their grid in a cellular fashion so that it will work even if there's a major grid failure. Now, in America, we have this aging, dirty, and insecure electricity system. We have to replace it anyway by 2050, but with what? Well, it turns out whether we replace it with more of what we've got, or with new nuclear build and so-called clean coal, or with centralized renewables, or with more distributed renewables, they all cost about the same, which was a bit of a surprise. But they differ profoundly in their risks around national security, fuel, water, technology, climate, health, finance. For example, we have this over-centralized grid that is very vulnerable to cascading and potentially economy-shattering blackouts, which could be caused by solar storms, bad space weather. That's just a question of when. It does happen from time to time. It could be caused by superstorms like we just had, by earthquakes, other natural disasters, floods. Could be caused by cyber attack or physical attack. But that blackout risk disappears, and all of the other risks I mentioned are best managed with distributed renewables reorganized into microgrids that normally interconnect but can stand alone at need. So they disconnect fractally, they reconnect seamlessly. Our own house does this. It's like living in an uninterruptible power supply. The house works with or without the grid. And this is where the Pentagon is headed for its own power supply because they need their stuff to work. Well, so do the rest of us whom they're defending. And pursued nationwide at about the same cost as business as usual, this resilient grid architecture would make us all a lot safer and also maximize our customer choice, entrepreneurial opportunity, and innovation. So let me summarize the electric sector. Together, efficient use and diverse, dispersed renewable resources are starting to transform this sector. In the old days, utilities would buy a lot of big coal and nuclear plants, maybe some big gas plants, a little bit of efficiency renewables, and those companies were typically rewarded, as they are here, as they are in 36 of the United States and all of Europe, for selling you more electricity. But where we reward them instead for cutting your bill, a funny thing happens. The investment shifts markedly towards efficiency, renewables, cogeneration, and ways to meld them together reliably with less transmission and little or no bulk electricity storage, which you'll notice was not part of the Texas requirement. So our energy future is not fate but choice, and that choice is very flexible. Around 1975 or 6, the U.S. government and industry all insisted that the energy needed to make a dollar of GDP could never go down. So it was considered heretical and very surprising and controversial when I published an article in Foreign Affairs saying it could actually go down by about a factor 3. What happened? Well, it's come down by a factor 2 so far. We're pretty much on schedule. And with today's much better technologies and integrative designs and more mature finance and delivery channels, we can now clearly see another tripling of efficiency in prospect at even lower cost. So to solve the energy problem, we just needed to integrate it and enlarge it. And the results may seem at first incredible. They did surprise even us. But as Marshall McLuhan said, only puny secrets need protection. Big discoveries are protected, he said, by public incredulity. Now let's combine the electricity and oil stories, and we get the big story, Reinventing Fire, where business enabled and sped by smart policies in mindful markets lead us completely off oil and coal by 2050, saving $5 trillion, growing the economy 2.6-fold, strengthening our security. Oh, and by the way, also reducing fossil carbon emissions by 82 to 86%. Now, if you like any of those outcomes, any one or more, you could support this transition without needing to like every outcome and without needing to agree about which outcomes are more important. So by focusing on outcomes, not motives, we can turn gridlock and conflict into a harmonious and unifying solution to our common energy challenge and at the same time get the most effective solutions to the big global problems that are hazarding every country's prosperity and security. Our team at RMI helps smart companies and governments to get unstuck and speed this journey via various sectoral initiatives. Of course, there's a lot of old thinking out there too. As former oilman Maurice Strong said, not all the fossils are in the fuel. But DuPont's former chairman, Edgar Woolard, reminds us that firms hampered by old thinking won't be a problem because, he says, in the long run, they simply won't be around. What I've described here is not just a once-in-a-civilization business opportunity. It's one of the greatest transformations in the history of our species because we humans are really inventing a new fire, not dug from below, but flowing from above. I've even heard theologians talk about energy from hell and energy from heaven. And this new fire is very different. It is not scarce but bountiful, not transient but permanent, not local but everywhere, not costly but free. But for the transitional tail of natural gas and a bit of biofuel grown in ways that sustain and endure, this new fire is flameless. And efficiently used, it really could make energy do our work without working our undoing. Now, each of you owns a piece of that prize, and our book details how each of you can capture that opportunity. So, with the conversation begun at reinventingfire.com, let me invite each of you to engage with us and each other and everyone around you to help make the world richer, fairer, cooler, and safer by together reinventing fire. Thank you.
Let me ask the first question. Remember when we were discussing before we came up here, you told me this amazing story of how Germany has sort of got rid of its dependence on French nuclear power and even shut down its nuclear stations and is now doing okay. What happened?
Well, Chancellor Merkel, who is from the most conservative and pro-nuclear party, was quite shocked by Fukushima. She was raised in the former East Germany, and she could understand that Chernobyl would happen under the Soviet system, but it was a shock to her it could happen under the Japanese system. So she realized she'd really misunderstood the whole risk assessment and social problem of running the technology. And she thought, well, we need to do something else. Let's make a bet that it might be smarter to invest our energy money to support German engineers and manufacturers and installers than to keep paying gas money to Gazprom. Well, she's won her bet. But of course, when the parliament overwhelmingly voted right after Fukushima to shut down 41% of their nuclear plants, the ones most like that one, the critics said, oh, this will crash the economy, the lights will go out, the carbon emissions and the price of electricity will soar, you'll have to buy nuclear power from France. None of that happened. Here's what did happen. Last year, the nuclear lost capacity was more than made up just in that year, and 60% of it was made up by renewable growth. Well, let's see. They shut down 41%, 60% of that is about 25%, so that means if they repeated for 3 more years the pace of renewable additions they did last year alone, they would have displaced their entire pre-Fukushima nuclear output. Okay, then there's efficiency. Last year, the German economy grew 3%. Their energy use fell 5.2%. Now, this was aided by a milder winter than usual, but they've done a lot of efficiency, and they're really starting to take hold of the building opportunity. Their carbon emissions went down 2%. Their coal burning went down a little. It's actually dropped quite dramatically over time. The electricity prices went down 10 or 15%. They remained an electricity exporter, although by less than they used to do. And in the cold snap this February, they actually exported almost 3 gigawatts of surplus to power-starved France.
With all the nuclear plants.
Yeah, but in order to soak up their nuclear excess, France always had to promote electric heating, which means in very cold weather, they suddenly need far more electricity than even their nuclear overcapacity can make. So that's when they have to import. But remember, everybody's in a unified European grid.
Yeah.
So they all have the same, a common and individual carbon targets. They all swap power from all sources. And in France, which was about 3/4 nuclear electricity, or Austria, which is none, or Germany, which was 29%, the electricity prices have all equilibrated.
Give me, what can Singapore do that could sort of take advantage of all this? You know Singapore reasonably well. You've been here some years. You met our officials. What are the things that Singapore can do to get this kind of energy efficiency, apart from changing our light bulbs?
Well, yeah, we'll retrofit your lights later, but you have some excellent engineers, you have an exceptional civil service, you have a lot of entrepreneurs. There are a few things missing, and they're mostly, I think, in the institutional framework, in the rules. Because government should steer, not row, but it's industry that takes things to scale. But then it works under rules. For example, I think you still reward your electricity provider for selling more electricity, not for cutting customers' bills. And you don't have perhaps as easy a journey as you might like to sell your own electricity back to the grid. So I'd like to see a Texas-style plug-and-play rule where if you have an inverter that's approved for the various health and safety requirements and to protect the lineman using the interface standards like IEEE 1547, you can just plug in and start generating and running your meter backwards. You don't need to ask or tell the utility. I'd like to see the utility's interests aligned with the customer's interests so they actually make more money by cutting your bill than by selling you more. We've done this in 14 of the United States. The Trade Association of the Utility supports it. It reduces their costs and risks. I'd like to suggest letting all ways to save or produce energy compete in the same bidding, the same auction, as they do in 19 of the United States. So they compete fairly at honest prices, regardless of which kind they are, saving or supply, what technology they use, where they are, how big they are, and who owns them. And then let's see who wins.
So you compete on the price, not on how you make the electricity.
Yeah. I'd like to see, and this was where the government could also lead, paying our architects and engineers for what they save, not what they spend. This has a very salutary effect on design. There are, about 60 or 80 well-known barriers to buying energy efficiency, and we need to bust them systematically, but each one can be turned into a business opportunity. And then we need to rethink the whole business model of the electricity business, because as we increasingly make zero-net energy buildings, which are becoming the standard now in California and Europe, that means over the course of the year the building produces at least as much electricity as it uses. Well, if you're the customer and I'm the utility and I charge you by the kilowatt hour and you don't use any net over the course of the year, what do I charge you for? I'm providing you a lot of useful services. You're probably selling some back to me, but we need to compensate each other for that on a different basis, recognizing that electricity is not a commodity, it's an infrastructure.
Okay, questions? Who would like to ask the first question? Please. Again, if you don't mind, identify yourself for Amory.
My name is Ruben Hintz. I'm a PhD student here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Thank you for an excellent talk, but watching the presentation, it wasn't really clear what role individuals can play. Other than just waiting for all these things to come down the industrial pipeline, what can we do to sort of speed up the process?
Where we are now is the result of millions of individual choices. Where we need to get to is also the result of millions of better informed individual choices. So let's become informed and tell our families and friends and neighbors what we find, what we're learning. Whenever you buy something that uses energy, get the most efficient available, and make your views known to your government at all levels. You vote also, of course, with your wallet. And companies are exquisitely sensitive to what you do or don't buy, especially if you tell them why you did so. I've been dealing over the years with heads of many of the world's largest companies, and they uniformly tell me, you know, we're not terribly worried by regulation. We can always get around that one way or another or influence it, but we're terrified by those activists with their emails. If they decide that we're a bad company, we're gone. We lose our franchise. We lose our social license to operate. And we need to make sure that that all of the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who work for me don't do anything that causes that, but on the contrary, make all of our customers and potential customers feel we are the kind of company that they want to do business with because we're helping them take responsibility for creating the world they want. So I think it's that simple. It's your individual choices, and there are many of those in how you live your life, what you value, what you do or don't buy and do. And many people around you watch that and are influenced by your example.
Please, Tian. Professor Tian Srinivasan from our school.
Thank you for your very fascinating talk. One aspect of it bothers me. This is integrating a number of things that you mentioned into one whole. Two problems I see. One is the tail risk, that is, you're concentrating all the risks in one whole thing. And so, even though the individual events, individual failures, the probability may go down, but the systemic collapse, that is, say, a collapse with low probability but very high social costs, seems to increase in this integration. I don't know whether I'm misperceiving the
risk. Are you
risk.
talking about the electric system?
Electric system in particular.
Yeah.
And also you have other systems integrated with the electric system. Your savings comes from quite a few things being integrated together and planned together. And that's why it's, on the one hand, it concentrates savings. It's on the other hand, it concentrates risks also, tail risk in particular, high cost, low probability event happening.
But this is where we are now with the electricity system.
Yes.
And that is why we have phenomena like the Northeast blackout in the U.S. We have a regional blackout every decade or so. The huge blackouts that have been in various European countries, the recent Indian blackouts, that simply cascade across the grid. Now, if this were caused, for example, by a concerted cyber attack, it could put even a country as big as the United States back in the 7th century, probably permanently. Yeah. It's probably not a recoverable event. And this is exactly why the distributed generation model with netted microgrids that can island, that can break apart fractally and run their own vital loads until the grid is restored, that is the approach to resilience. And actually, if you look back at rmi.org to a book called Brittle Power that we did for the Pentagon in 1981, it's still the definitive unclassified analysis of how to make electric systems resilient. And Chapter 13 lays out all the design principles for how to do that. Now, Denmark has actually been doing this. I mentioned its cellular grid. And every year, they stress test it by cutting off the grid supply to the cells, the microgrids, to make sure that the vital loads are still met, and they are. And maybe the most spectacular example, although I wouldn't want to live there, is what Cuba has done. Cuba had these 11, I think, rather geriatric and frequently failing giant heavy oil plants from the Soviet era and a very centralized grid design. So by 2005, they were up to 224 serious blackout days per year. And Fidel and Raul Castro said, fix this, and the guy they told to fix it happened to have read some of my work in the 70s and thought, let's try a distributed approach. It sounds more resilient. So they bought on export credit an entire shipload from China of equivalent top European standard efficiency refrigerators, rice cookers, lights, fans, and I think pumps or something like that, maybe air conditioners. And since it's a dictatorship, they were able to deploy them nationwide in 9 months. And then they did an inverted tariff structure, public education about la revolución energética. They did distributed generation. They wanted to go for wind power and solar, but they were late in the queue, and it would have taken too long to get through the order waiting list. So they got a bunch of engine generators instead, and since Chavez gives them free oil in exchange for doctors, they weren't worried about the oil price for the moment. And then they reorganized the grid as a netted islandable set of microgrids. So they went from 224 serious blackout days in 2005 to 3 in 2006 to 0 in 2007. And in 2008, 2 hurricanes in 2 weeks shredded their eastern grid, and they were still able to sustain vital services. I wrote this up for our field commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan as a guide to reconstruction, and they were very interested in seeing the data.
Didn't the CIA charge you for helping the enemy Cuba?
I didn't do anything for Cuba.
Okay,
But
the last question.
I mean, we
up
can
there.
learn from them even if we don't agree with their politics.
The last question from the lady, and we have passed our time. So,
Okay,
yeah.
I'll make it quick. My name is Bernice. So I'm curious about cradle to cradle and what you think about this approach to manufacturing and industry, and whether you think this is something significant that needs to happen for this future that you describe, and if so, then what needs to happen for that to be possible?
Cradle to cradle, which has been popularized by the American architect Bill McDonough, is a very nice concept originating with Walter Staël at the Institut de Ré in Genève. And the idea is that you design out waste. Everything is in closed loops. It's what's called a circular economy in China. It's actually, in effect, required in Germany and much of the EU by producer life cycle responsibility. And it's a very good approach. It's actually one of 4 interlocked principles of what we call natural capitalism. And that is a 13-year-old business bestseller you can download free at natcap.org, along with a Harvard Business Review summary. So that business book describes a new way of doing business as if nature and people were properly valued, but without needing to know or signal their value. It combines radical resource productivity, not just for water, but for not just for energy, but for water, materials, and everything else. Closed loop, non-toxic production with no waste, the way nature produces things, often with a biomimetic model. A business model we call the solutions economy that rewards those 2 shifts. And finally, reinvesting some of the resulting savings back into the sort of capital we're shortest of, namely nature. And the title natural capitalism comes from the notion that capitalism is the productive use of and reinvestment in capital. But what's capital? Industrial capitalism only focuses on 2 kinds, money and goods, physical and financial capital. But it ignores or even liquidates the 2 most valuable kinds, human and natural capital. And that's a very material omission, because without people, there's no economy, and without nature, there's no people. So we actually go back in economic history and note that if around 1750 someone had come into Parliament in London and said, don't worry that there aren't enough weavers to make enough cloth for most people to afford, we'll just make weavers 100 times more productive, nobody would have understood the concept, let alone thought it was possible. But that's what happened, because soon a Lancashire spinner could make the cloth that used to require 200 weavers. So we soon had affordable mass goods, purchasing power, middle class, and as it spread through all sectors, to simplify the story a bit, we ended up with all the artifacts that we now see around us as the hallmarks of an advanced industrial economy. Well, in those days, you see, the relative scarcity of people was limiting progress in exploiting seemingly boundless nature. Now we have the opposite condition of scarcity. We've got abundant people and scarce nature. So now it's no longer people, but nature we need to be using 10 or 100 times more productively. And with that bedrock principle of resource productivity, the next logical step is indeed closing the materials loops, because it turns out that the mass flow in a country like the United States, the stuff that we extract or grow and process and then throw stuff away, this stream is 99.98% pure waste. It's got to be the biggest opportunity on the planet to eliminate that waste, to design it out. The right number is 0. That's where we should head. And therefore, going back to the notion there are 4 kinds of capital, not 2, if you play with a full deck with all 4 kinds of capital, you end up making more money, having more fun, and doing more good, and by the way, gaining stunning competitive advantage.
You know, we could carry on all night, but you've got other appointments to go to. But I'm going to conclude by making a very important point to all of you. You know, he's got brilliant ideas. Most people who have brilliant ideas keep it to themselves. He shares it with the rest of the world. You can download Natural Capitalism free of charge. And believe me, it's a brilliant book. Do look even at the short Harvard Business Review article that captures it very well. But the amazing thing is that if a country like Cuba can pick it up, it's a sign of how ideas travel. And I hope that at least the students at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, which come over from over 50 countries, please take back Amory's ideas free of charge and implement them, and you'll see some miraculous results. So for that, we thank you very much, Amory, and we hope you come back again.
Thank you.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.